Cool. Just here. There we go. All right. Welcome, everyone, to the Cambridge Negotiation Institute Roundtable, Dispute Resolution in the Era of Climate Crisis. I'm Krista deBoer, one of the founders and a principal of CNI. I'm also joined today by my colleague, CNI co-founder and senior fellow at Harvard Law School, Bob Bordone. I will say up front that if somehow we lose connection, we will try to connect back in immediately. So if you lose us, just log back on and hopefully we'll restart up. Today we are thrilled to have people from all over the world joining us, including from all over the US, Argentina, Switzerland, Peru, Brazil, Bangladesh, Hungary, Serbia, Australia, the UK, and Mexico. Welcome to everyone. It's great to have you all here. And we are also thrilled to have a world-class panel assembled today. As a matter of course, I will briefly introduce each panelist, but the link for their full bios is in the chat box. I've asked each panelist to share their insights with us in about 12 minutes or so, which is a lot to ask given their breadth of knowledge. But after the presentations, we will have some time for conversation and questions that will come from all of you via the chat function. Then we'll have a final word and end at about 1:30 p.m. Eastern. We'll also be recording today's event, which will be accessible on our website in the next day or so, along with all of our other roundtable events that we've previously had. So we invite you to check those out. With regard to the topic of today's event, I have to say that from my perspective, this roundtable is incredibly timely. I'm located in California, where the effects of the climate crisis are in this very moment undeniable and stark. I'm sure, as most of you are aware, we have at once kind of historic wildfires that have burned over 3 million acres. And we have an ongoing drought with sort of no real end in sight either. This morning in the New York Times, I read a quote from a mother in Oakland, which is in Northern California, kind of near the worst where the fires are sort of burning the worst. And she said, we're in a pandemic and a heat wave, and we don't have air conditioning. We can't open up the window due to the smoke in the air. We're trapped, we're hot, and no one can come over to play. So that sort of sums up the situation we have going on right now, sadly. So these conditions spur intensified and more numerous disputes that are arising out of this climate crisis regarding things, for example, like where to relocate displaced populations, how to best reduce carbon output, how to allocate resources, how to allocate liability and risk, and the like. To help us think through the complicated dispute resolution issues associated with this crisis, we are fortunate to have our panel today. So without further ado, let me turn to our first panelist, Erin Ryan, to kick us off by giving us an overview of the conceptual and legal landscape in which all of our panelists do the work of resolving climate-related disputes. Erin Ryan is a professor and associate dean for environmental programs at Florida State University College of Law. She is also the author of many scholarly works, including Federalism and The Tug of War Within. And she is a former U.S. forest ranger. Thank you very much, Erin.
Thank you, Krista, for that kind introduction, and even more for the invitation to be part of this important and compelling conversation. I actually am going to be using some PowerPoint slides with my presentation, and Krista, you are in charge of that. So I just want to make sure we get that going. And I'll let everyone know, if you are someone who likes to see the speaker more than the slides, you all have the opportunity in Zoom to resize this by, you can decide for yourself how much of me you want to see and how much of the slides you want to see by resizing it on the left-hand side. But let me just begin by acknowledging what I think we all agree, being here, that climate change is already and will continue to call for negotiated dispute resolution across every imaginable spectrum, from international greenhouse gas treaties to refugee crisis management to rethinking private law, insurance contracts, and commercial norms. The presentation that I'm going to give today is going to focus specifically on the public law challenges of climate governance and why it's going to be a project of negotiation virtually by definition. And I will be drawing on a long-standing research agenda, some of which is shown on that first slide, about negotiated multi-level governance, and especially environmental governance, which is so often the result of various forms of bargaining among local, state, regional, national, and international agents of government with input from all kinds of private stakeholders. This phenomenon of negotiated governance exists in all realms of law, but it is especially salient in environmental contexts, and it is especially demonstrated in climate governance over the last few decades, because as we all know, climate change is the paradigmatic, super wicked collective action problem. It requires global cooperation by billions of individual actors around the world in the absence of any kind of centralized authority to encourage or even enforce the agreements that we need to be able to make to move forward together. So basically, it is a giant prisoner's dilemma, which negotiation theorists know really can only be resolved by aligning our conflicting short-term and long-term incentives somehow, usually through cooperation facilitated by skilled negotiation or dispute resolution. But climate change is also a super wicked interjurisdictional problem, requiring cooperation not only among individuals, but also between separately acting centers of sovereign authority, governments that regulate these people, and which may be competing for power for reasons having nothing to do with climate. Greenhouse gas pollution, as we all know, is the ultimate border-crossing environmental harm, because greenhouse gases produced anywhere by anyone will evenly distribute throughout the Earth's atmosphere and impact everyone. So it's a truly global problem. But it starts with the most local and even personal choices about the homes we live in, the buildings we work in, how we get to work, even what we eat. So it's an international crisis whose causes and solutions are profoundly local in nature. And that is why climate governance requires interventions at the national and international level, as Sue will surely discuss today, but it also intersects with state natural resources law that one of our other panelists, Joaquin, manages, like water allocation and power generation, and land use and other local regulations that another of our panelists, Lucy, works within. So my presentation today is designed to distill the lessons of negotiated environmental governance to set the stage for their presentations, which will move through these different levels of jurisdictional scale. And my goal in my remarks is not so much to introduce specific strategies for climate governance, which I think they will do, but to explain why all of the specific strategies that my co-panelists will talk about ultimately begin with and require negotiation. So to give you a sense of how I'm going to share that, if you would advance to the next slide.
Apologies, Erin. I think I got ahead of you there. So is this where we want to be on your outline?
Where we are right now. Yeah. So we're here. This is an outline of how that was all introduction, and here's an outline of what I'm going to cover today, starting with that introduction. The introduction I've just given of climate change at the epicenter of multi-level governance controversy. And I'm going to argue that it's for two basic reasons. One of them has to do with the nature of environmental problems like climate change, and I will focus on that one in this talk. The other reason, which I'm going to kind of gloss over today, has to do with the nature of multi-level governance disputes in general, where multiple levels of government have to work together to solve problems. And that has to do with the nature of the values that come in conflict in these situations. And I'm not going to dwell on that part of the problem, but let me set up our conversation by asking you to consider this. With all interjurisdictional problems like climate governance, we're always struggling with two central questions. And one of them is the policy question. We have this problem, what are we going to do about it? What policy will address it? If the problem is that we have too much greenhouse gas production, how can we have less? Should it be by cap and trade? Should it be by a carbon tax? Should it be geoengineering? That's the policy question. But the other question that often gets in the way of our approaching that first one is, when we have multiple levels of government operating, which one gets to decide what the answer to question number one is going to be? Who gets to decide what the policy issue will be? And all problems of regulatory scale ultimately boil down to this issue. Should this decision be one that's going to be made centrally, where it will have the same answer for everyone in the polity, no matter where you live? Or should this kind of decision be made locally, where the answer may differ depending on where you live and local circumstances? And I'm going to argue that especially what we see in climate governance, is that negotiation is the best and sometimes the only strategy to get to good governance, both because it resolves the jurisdictional uncertainties in federal systems like ours and in international systems without a unifying central government, and also to sort through the competing values at stake. And it helps us redirect stalled governance efforts away from zero-sum models that we know are ineffective in individual private disputes and are just as ineffective often in the climate context toward a more collaborative, cooperative model. So if you would advance to the next slide, Krista. This is a slide for the legal people just to point out the nature of this problem. Environmental disputes have always been the canary in the constitutional coal mine of these problems of local and central decision-making. Many of you, if you are lawyers, will know that many of the Supreme Court's most contentious federalism cases, the US federal system is where we play out the local national debate often, they're really environmental cases. And by the same token, many of the Supreme Court's most contentious environmental cases are really federalism cases. Next slide. For those of you who are not lawyers, you'll see, let me introduce the basic problem in a nutshell. Environmental law, and especially climate change related environmental problems, are prone to this kind of controversy because they allocate power, the power to decide policy, the power to answer question number one, in contexts where both the local and the national claim to that authority are simultaneously at their strongest. Meaning, if the big question in multi-level governance cases is who should get to decide, environmental law and climate especially is the place where both the state and the federal claims for authority, arguments for why they should be the one that gets to decide, are most persuasive. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, the first reason for this problem has to do with the nature of environmental disputes, which very often match the need to regulate some useful or harmful activity that takes place in a certain place, like power generation, with the need to regulate the boundary crossing harms associated with that use, like greenhouse gas generation. And so you can see the problem right here. We have, especially in the United States, we have this hallowed understanding that governing land use is among the most sacred of local prerogatives. That's what local governments do. It's the backbone of the police power to regulate public health and safety, while regulating harmful externalities is among the original predicates of national authority. It's why we had to reject our first take at a constitution in the Articles of Confederation for one that has stronger centralized power. Next slide. Now, you might ask, what is so special about environmental disputes? Because don't we see the same kind of dilemmas playing out in all these other areas of law with disputes in criminal law or health law or educational or family law? And the short answer is, yes, we do. Increasingly, we see these kind of controversies playing out there as well. But the problems arose first in environmental law, and they are viscerally worse, especially in climate contexts. Next slide. Because of this feature, the connection to land use, the connection between environmental law and land use. Even climate change starts, it ends up in the atmosphere, but it starts with activities that people are mostly conducting on land in a specific place, or maybe moving between places. And the reason why land use complicates things, this is really the bottom line, is that land is more different than people. And my images here on the slide are evidence of that proposition. So if the question is whether to have the same answer everywhere or different answers depending on where you are, then the whole where you are factor may be more important if the issue is connected to actual differences in the land. I don't want to overstate this. People are obviously also very different. Communities can be very different too, but land is just more different. Next slide. And it leads to the problem of environmental management being very idiosyncratic. So we have widespread consensus on what we're aiming for in these other areas of law, public health, criminal law, widespread consensus on what we mean by health or theft or math, and where state laws do differ. They mostly differ at the margins. But by contrast, environmental management choices differ radically between and even within states because land is so locally unique. So think about what it would take to manage air pollution in California, especially right now, as Krista has remarked upon. And now think about what it would take to manage the same kind of problem in somewhere else like Florida or Iowa or New York. And you'll probably notice that these wholly different contexts imply different kinds of challenges, which may require different strategies and expertise. Next slide. So in fact, you don't have to imagine it. I'll just tell you. Here's a partial list of all the things that you would need to think about to regulate air pollution in any of these places. You would need to know the contours of the land, the elevation, the precipitation, the seasonal weather patterns, the prevailing winds, the transportation corridors, the methods of transportation, the population density, the zoning law, the building codes, energy production, energy usage patterns, the local economy where the industry is operating at any moment in time. You might care about watershed and soil quality and habitat and what the stresses are. And you would have to be pretty up close and personal to know the answers to these questions and to see them as they change, which doesn't mean that national or international actors can't be there paying attention. In the United States, regional administration is for that exact purpose, but it does mean, next slide, that to answer the question of how to regulate air and water pollution, that answer may be very different in different contexts. And getting the answer wrong can be really costly to communities. Next slide. Bad decisions made without the benefit of local expertise can portend serious environmental, cultural, and economic harm if things go wrong. Damage to air, soil, water, and other local resources can create devastating consequences for entire communities. And that, of course, is the basis for the local claim for managing these problems. But here's the thing. If one community fails to prevent spillover harms to another community with, for example, greenhouse gases, the stakes are exactly the same. The stakes are equally high. And that's the claim for national or international management of these problems. And it's why we have to have both. And we end up having both. And the problem is, next slide, how do they play nicely together? And so we describe in the biz, we describe this as a problem of the interjurisdictional gray area, where there are simultaneous regulatory interests and obligations at different levels of regulatory scale. And the governance issue is always the same. Well, who should get to decide? If I were going to talk about the constitutional dimensions, I would talk about why it looks tidy, but it really isn't. I'll just posit the uncertainty and move to the next slide to talk about the consequences of that uncertainty. Uncertainty about who should get to decide has been really devastating in the climate arena. So we end up with hesitant policymaking on things like cap and trade initiatives, a failed federal attempt, some successful state-based regional attempts, the RGGI, the Western Climate Initiative, but they're not as effective because there's lots of leakage. Also, anytime anybody wants to act in this sphere, they are immediately challenged through litigation by the other side. No, that's not for you to regulate, that's for me. So the Clean Power Plan was immediately challenged when the Obama administration posited that as our best approach for managing climate harms. When states try to enact renewable portfolio standards that have extraterritorial impact because of who they buy power from, they're frequently challenged under the Dormant Commerce Clause. But the worst problem may be when the different sides aren't saying, no, that's mine, I get to regulate. It's when they say, oh, that's not me, that's for you to deal with. And we have abdication in critical gray areas like climate. So after the president withdrew us from the Paris Climate Accord, half the states tried to say, we're gonna do it anyway, but then the other half were like, yeah, well, we're out. That's not for us to do. And the federal government's like, yeah, well, that's not for us to do. And then nothing gets done. That leads to this need for negotiated response. So next slide. This is the part of the talk that I'm skipping over, where I would then go into the fact that multi-level governance is also a problem. In the next slide, I would try to convince you that strategies like federalism and other multi-governmental, multi-level governance strategies are designed to negotiate among competing, the next slide please, competing good governance values that we can talk about later if we want. Next slide, the problem is there's lots of tension between them. Next slide, but the result for actual governance in the climate arena is that people still have to decide. People still have to figure out what to do. And what is really interesting, what's really fascinating in the last several decades is seeing how much that uncertainty about how to share and divide regulatory authority in these contexts of overlap has led to the response of negotiated governance. A substantial amount of environmental and especially climate governance ends up being jointly constructed by state and federal and sometimes international actors beyond the polity in a variety of ways, next slide, that range from really obvious conventional forms of bargaining, like smoke-filled backroom bargaining over enforcement or lawmaking, to more sophisticated forms of negotiating over reallocating constitutionally delegated authority under the spending power and interstate compacts, to elaborate statutory programs of joint policymaking, which are like statutory programs of dispute systems design that encourage the different actors to work within a framework to negotiate their differences and jointly construct a solution. And so the last slide on which I will end is that if I leave you with nothing else, I want to leave you with this closing point. And that is that this kind of governance that has frequently been characterized as a zero-sum game is not a zero-sum game. We often talk about it that way, as though in the US, the federal and state governments are locked in a bitter antagonistic struggle for power in which every win by one side is a loss for the other. But in fact, what we see is that the line between these jurisdictions, the state and federal power, is very often itself a project of negotiation at levels large and small. And the best governance incorporates multi-scalar contributions that can empower both sides by ensuring that policies will be informed by local and national wisdom. And with that, I hand the floor back to Krista and our other panelists.
Okay, thank you very much. Really appreciate that very quick lay of the land. A lot to think about there, a lot of challenges, but a lot of room for opportunity too. So with that, you know, I appreciate, Erin, that you focused on that tension between the land and our shared space, our shared resources. With that, we're going to turn to Lucy Moore, who will ground us in the conflicts and issues that are on the land. Lucy has been a mediator for many years, starting in the late 1980s. Her focus has been natural resources and public policy disputes, and her clients have included federal, state, and local agencies, tribal governments and communities, public interest organizations, and industry. Lucy is the author of Common Ground on Hostile Turf, Stories from an Environmental Mediator, and Into the Canyon, 7 Years in Navajo Country. Welcome, Lucy.
Thank you so much, Krista. And also thank you to Erin for a great power-packed introduction. And as she said, I'm going to kind of bring us back down to earth and describe a case that I'm working on now that very much has to do with the land. I'm an environmental mediator. I would add, I'm not a lawyer. As a mediator, my goal, of course, is to bring parties together, build relationships among them, build some degree of trust, because the decision is in their hands, not mine, about what the solution is going to be to the environmental conflict. So that's how I begin every case. And the tools that I use as a mediator are quite simple and quite human-based. Listening, reflecting people's interests to each other, taking time to build those relationships and that trust among people, helping create some ideas for solutions, helping parties come to solutions themselves. Most of my cases last several years and often involve many parties and sometimes many issues. So the case I want to talk about is actually right in my backyard. Although I do work nationally and regionally. I'm in Santa Fe, New Mexico, Southwest US. I'm in the shadow of Los Alamos National Laboratories, which, as you probably know, is the birthplace of the atomic bomb and has an incredible history locally, nationally, and globally. The work at Los Alamos has been has resulted in hazardous contamination of the land and the resources in the area. And there is a federal act, federal legislation, the Natural Resources Damage Assessment Act, also known as NRDA by those of us who work in the NRDA field. And that act calls for compensation for the loss of natural resources or cultural resources by the public or tribal interests. So here we have Los Alamos, a big contaminating, spewing hazardous waste facility, uphill, that's significant, draining contaminants down into surface water, groundwater, damaging resources. For the 4 tribes that are surrounding Los Alamos National Labs, the damage has been significant, and that is the case that I am working on and have been working on for about 6 years now. The Natural Resources Damage Assessment Act calls for creating a trustee council, and that council is made up, in this case, of 4 separate tribal entities. They're called pueblos in New Mexico, the Department of Energy, the Los Alamos National Labs, the Forest Service, and the State of New Mexico Environment Department. So those parties meet with me as mediator once a month. We've been meeting, as I say, for 6 years. We've been working on assessment, figuring out how to describe the damage done to the resources of the pueblos and the natural and cultural resources. We are now at the point of trying to determine the injury, the loss of service that has been the result of the contamination. And just to give you an example, one of the pueblos has a sacred site that is is on Pueblo property, but because of the nature of the work at Los Alamos, eminent domain just took over large areas. That particular area had a very important cultural site on it, actually having to do with the origin of that particular tribe. That has been off limits for 45 years from that pueblo. That means that there's a loss of that cultural thread in that society. It's like the fabric that holds that society together has lost important threads out of it. Young people have not been able to go to that sacred site for initiation ceremonies, for healing ceremonies. Plants cannot be gathered there that have been gathered there for hundreds, if not thousands of years. The cultural damage is severe. So we are now at the point of looking at restoration projects. The Natural Resources Damage Assessment Act calls for the first remedy is to restore the resource. It's damaged, fix it to the condition it was in before this contamination happened. That cannot happen with, for instance, this sacred site with groundwater contamination that is unstoppable, flowing downhill into the aquifer underneath one of the pueblos. So the second course of remedy, if you can't restore it, is to replace it. Find some equivalent resource somewhere else. Well, you can't take the sacred site of the place of origin for that pueblo and say, well, you did have a nice place of origin, but what about that mesa over there? That would be a good place to have your origin myth, wouldn't it? Obviously, you can't replace something like that. So the third remedy and final remedy is compensation. This poses a big challenge for tribes. What you're asking them to do is to put a price tag on something that is sacred, on something that is a part of nature, is a part of their religion and culture, and which their society depends. And it's insulting, offensive, just impossible for them to think about. Of course, we all realize in the end, it will come down to monetized, some kind of figure that will be, it will look like a project. It could be a riparian restoration project. It could be a land exchange. It could be building a small dam. It could look all kinds of ways. Project will be the equivalent of compensation for the loss to the pueblos. There are several challenges here. I'm going to check my time. Okay. There are several challenges, and one is how to have a solution that is acceptable to the Department of Justice, which is the final decider of, is this project, it's going to be funded by Congress, is this a legitimate part of the settlement for this act? And how to describe and determine the cultural losses, the fact that elderly medicine men are not able to do what they could do before, the fact that there may be higher depression rates in the community, the fact that youth may be turning to drugs. How do you describe that as a damage, when we're so used to doing that in other kinds of terms, and how will we make it so that the Department of Justice will accept that evidence, that as evidence of the injury. Another challenge that has come just recently, in our last meeting, we reviewed some possible early restoration projects that we might undertake to get some kind of benefit as early as possible. And one of them was a riparian restoration of a stream that had been badly damaged in catastrophic fires in recent decades. The problem that somebody raised was, what if we do a very elaborate restoration project, small check dams, et cetera, a lot of planting, and because of the catastrophic nature events that are happening these days, we just in Santa Fe had 2 inches of snow yesterday. the earliest, coldest day in recorded history. We've had massive floods, we've had fires. So what if a restoration project is identified and built for the long term? It's supposed to last 75 years, and one of these catastrophic events comes and wipes it out. How do we settle with any kind of confidence that our fix, that our compensation for resources dearly lost is really going to work, is really going to last? So although I don't usually think of climate change in the work that I'm doing, it is increasingly a player at the table, as it is in this one. And I just want to close with something that I heard from Bill McKibben, the great climate change activist. Somebody asked him, where would you, given the crisis in the world, and where would you go? Where would you go for safety? And instead of saying, well, I'd find high ground so I didn't get flooded, or I'd find this, or I'd find that, he said, I would just find a community that can resolve problems itself, that can come to agreement on how to move forward. And I think that that's what we are trying to do with this case. And I think that's the power of mediation in this kind of case, is to simply try to come together for the best solution. And in this case, we have federal agencies, we have actually all levels of regulation here. And if we can maintain the trust that we have built, I think we will come to a good solution, probably 2 years off from now. So thank you so much. Happy to answer questions, delighted to be here. Thanks, Krista.
Thank you, Lucy. It really is an inescapable problem. And so I love your comment on kind of the resiliency and the importance of resiliency in communities at the community level as a way to respond. Thank you. Next, I'm delighted to introduce Joaquin Esquivel. Joaquin is the chair of the California State Water Resources Control Board. Previously, Chair Esquivel served as the Assistant Secretary for Federal Water Policy at the California Natural Resources Agency, and he worked for U.S. Senator Barbara Boxer for more than 8 years, most recently as her legislative assistant covering the agriculture, Native American, water, oceans, and nutrition portfolios. Welcome and thanks for being here today, Chair Esquivel.
Really appreciate it, Krista, and just glad to be able to join such an incredible panel. Really appreciated Erin's summary and Lucy's discussion as well of a really critical local water sharing project and in need. I'll start really quick. Again, Joaquin Esquivel, chair of the State Water Board. We at the State Water Board are composed of 5 individuals. We have 9 regional water quality control boards. Each of those boards have 7 board members, their own chairs, their own executive officers. So when we talk about sort of state structures, the State Water Resources Control Board is pretty unique. I think generally when we talk, and it's been acknowledged, about climate change, water is probably where most impacts are felt most acutely. Certainly the state knows that as we went through our historic drought of record, a drought that led to massive tree mortality and is now seeing a consequence when we look at the wildfires that are burning. And so there's certainly this continuity of continued impacts to hydrology from climate change, and then the conflicts that those certainly in drought bring between water users. But I think it's important sometimes to start off by acknowledging that when we talk about conflict resolution and even these institutions that we've created, there's certainly the conflict that can occur between individuals and groups. But I think that it's important to acknowledge that the creation of these entities, these organizations, the board being only about 50 years on here, we're meant to resolve the conflicts that we have with our natural environment. And in this case, water. So a quick blush in history of the State Water Resources Control Board, because I think it really does provide a good context and sort of blush as to what is the state role here, how is it balanced with then the very local needs, which, I would emphasize that it's all local. When we talk about impacts from climate change, when we talk about conflict resolution, it is about the local and the nested authorities and decision-making between the federal, state, and local entities. But ultimately, it all comes to roost at the local level. And it's about facilitating that good decision-making at those local levels that really, I feel, is some of the most important work that we need to be doing, because if you have that sort of leadership or authority just coming from the state level or just coming from the federal level, what you don't have is, I think, the sort of enduring effort that you need, the leadership and long-standing sort of resource management and leadership that has to happen at a local level. So the State Water Resources Control Board, again, 50 years on, was created with the Porter-Cologne Act in the state of California, and married at that time what were two different offices: a water rights office, which was created in about 1914, and then also a local pollution control boards that were throughout the state. And those were created in 1940. I think it's important to again note that, prior to that, across the state of California, there was no standard way by which discharges to water was regulated. Every local entity was left to its own sort of creation of laws and otherwise regulations to put into check any discharges into waterways, from wastewater treatment plants to industry to all the impacts. And as we know from examples of, storied examples of the Ohio River burning and other waterways throughout the state, that we're only about 50 years on when it comes to really the creation of most of entities like the State Water Resources Control Board, but passage of things at the federal level like the Clean Water Act, which for the first time tried to really tackle what is, as Erin pointed out, this really incredible challenge of regulating air and water, because it's absolute lack of consideration for the sorts of boundaries and political borders that we put around its ultimate management. And so the state board, again, 50 years on, married these two agencies, and 1940 is when the Dickey Act was passed in the state of California, which for the first time, again, attempted at the state level to regulate discharges to its waterways. The important structure, I think, there is that we are boards, that we are not one decision-making sort of figure at the top of an organization, but ourselves are again, composed of boards. We do all of our work in public. We have to abide by public meeting law, Brown Act, and Bagley-Keene and otherwise, which prevent any three of us from having a quorum. And I think that structure, that sort of democratization, if you will, of at that time, which was really about water quality and bringing in water rights to acknowledge that you can't regulate quantity and quality in a separate discussion, that you needed an agency that could do both, was really powerful. And again, I think that the distributive nature of our decision-making, the fact that we have 9 regional water quality control boards, to which, to Erin's point, you can't regulate the way you might regulate your waterways in a place like Florida as you would, say, in a place in the Northeast, up in Vermont. And similarly in California, given our size and our great varied hydrology, it's incredibly difficult to craft statewide water quality policy that's allowed to, that takes into account the variety, the specifics, and hydrology and stakeholders that really are dependent upon that local space, that local watershed. And so I think those are elements and qualities that have, I would proudly say, led to a number of successes when it comes to improving the quality of water in our state. But with climate change, that all really goes out the window. I really do feel that so much of the work has been sort of reconciling a system that we've inherited. Again, speaking to the newness relatively of entities like the State Water Resources Control Board and our laws around water governance generally, much of the infrastructure, much of the sort of decisions around water in our watersheds were done at a time when they didn't benefit from the greater scientific and technical understanding that we have now. So much of the work that we do, I feel, is around reconciling the system that we've inherited and looking forward then to challenges like climate change to say, how are we going to improve and be more nimble and responsive and given the uncertainties that climate change is posing. And just on, say, the water quality challenges we'll be facing alone from these current fires, there are significant issues that are going to be coming to roost. I would just flag that the other benefit that we have as a state agency at the State Water Resources Control Board is the fact that about 5 years ago, the Division of Drinking Water, which was previously at California's Department of Public Health, was also brought to the state board. So now when we look at the state board and its authorities, its purview and its ability to resolve conflict around so many of the challenges we face in water management, being able to have purview and say on water rights, how and when we take water out of our environment, to water quality, so how discharges are impacting that water, to then also water regulation at your tap. That full cycle of water in its watershed can, I think, hopefully be better taken into consideration, knowing that greater usage of wastewater for water recycling, continued conservation, these are all things, critical adaptations that we're going to need in the face of climate change when we talk about water, and being able to have an entity at the state level to work with the many disparate, and to give a sense of scale, we have over 7,000 water systems in the state of California that we at the State Water Resources Control Board regulate. And so that's an incredible amount of disparate decision-making that's happening throughout the state. But I feel having an entity like the State Water Resources Control Board certainly benefits to these bigger picture outcomes that we're really needing. I'll just say that, particularly when it comes to conflict resolution, trust is an incredibly important factor in all of that. Again, I would reflect on the state board's structure, the fact that we are a 5-member decision-making board with all of our regional boards, over 60 individuals throughout the state. And being able to see the boards debate in public, debate in open, what are, again, very difficult balancing decisions that the boards are called to make, I think helps build that trust. But I would say that what I've been concerned about is sometimes a feeling that there are sometimes different realities or different sets of sort of basic understandings in our watershed, and a lot of conflict around just sometimes not even having a shared understanding of what is happening, who's taking water out when, and that lack of sort of granularity can really hamper, I think, ultimately the transparency and trust that's necessary for us as agencies to operate in. When you have just a real mistrust of government agencies, the institutions, and the information that they may be providing. And so I think that is an element as well, along with obviously all the real challenges in the watersheds that climate change are going to be bringing to us. So I'll kind of pause, stop there, and allow the panelists to continue on, but look forward to the questions and discussion after for sure. So thank you.
Thanks, Chair Esquivel. Thank you too for highlighting the import of regulatory bodies as a component of conflict resolution, and the import too of the way those are structured to effectively deal with and be nimble when conflict comes their way. Thank you. Our final panelist is Sue Biniaz. Sue is a UN Foundation Senior Fellow for Climate Change. She previously served as the lead climate lawyer for the US State Department, and in that capacity played a central role in all major international climate negotiations, including the Paris Agreement. Since leaving the State Department, Sue has been teaching courses on international environmental law and international climate negotiations at Yale, Columbia, and the University of Chicago. Welcome, Sue. Thank you for being here.
Thanks so much. Can you hear me okay? I know I have microphone issues. Are you able to hear me? Yes?
We can hear you.
Okay. I'm going to speak as loudly as I can. I'm going to talk about dispute resolution on climate change at the international level. And what I mean by that is the international climate negotiations have been very controversial for the last several decades. So we lawyers and negotiators have had to develop many tools for resolving disputes. So first, I just wanted to say a couple words about why the negotiations have been so controversial. So at the global level, Here are a couple reasons, and then I'll mention some US specific challenges. So at the global level, climate change implicates entire economies. It's about your energy system, your agricultural system. It's not like some environmental agreements that deal with much more kind of micro aspects of economies. So it's much harder to agree to take on an international commitment. It's also an expensive problem to address. States have wildly different interests. So if you're an oil exporting country, you're worried about having the world move away from fossil fuels because it's kind of existential from an economic point of view. Whereas if you're a small island, you're worried about the existential threat to no longer existing because of sea level rise. So bringing the countries together with almost opposite points of view is extremely challenging. In the early stages of the negotiation, what was also challenging was that the problem was not before your eyes. So you didn't really see the impacts of climate change back then. It wasn't like some other issues like hazardous waste where you could see the problem and it was easier to get countries to get motivated to do something about it. For many developing countries, it was also not a priority, understandably. They were dealing with poverty eradication, hunger alleviation, and wondered, like, why is this my priority? We understand why this is a priority for developed countries, but not for us. And last point is there was a lot of resentment and blame because a lot of countries from the South wondered, why are these developed countries, which have basically caused the problem by emitting the bulk of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, why are they coming to us and asking us to do something? So that's kind of the global picture. Then in the US is particularly challenging space to deal with because it's not like a foreign policy issue normally is. The president can offer a Middle East peace plan without getting Congress's approval. It's part of the constitutional authority to engage in foreign affairs, diplomatic relations. But everything that the world wants from the US, which is essentially money to help with implementation or having the US reduce its greenhouse gas emissions, those all require some kind of congressional authority. So the executive branch is not really free to just take on any commitment and be able to implement it. It can take on the commitment, but it might not be able to implement the obligation. And in the US, the issues become more and more partisan over time as opposed to the other way around. So when you combine those challenges plus the global challenges, you can already see why you have a need for all kinds of tools to resolve disputes. So let me mention three of the most contentious issues through the last 25 or 30 years or so of the negotiations. One is, should all countries be treated in the same way? And if not, what should the distinction be in terms of who should have to do what? And what's the basis for the distinction? Back in the 90s, the thought was that countries could be divided between those that were in the OECD, so basically the richer countries, and the former Soviet republics. And those were given slightly higher obligations in the initial treaty. Over time, that became less and less of a tenable distinction as the major developing countries began emitting more and more. So over time, we have seen sort of a gradual move away from that kind of what we used to call bifurcation towards a much more, still a differentiated approach in that not everybody's supposed to do the same thing, but it's not starkly divided between one category and another category. The other issue that's been kind of dogging us is how much does the international agreement dictate what each country has to do, and how much does it leave some national discretion? And if you follow the different agreements over time, you've got the Kyoto Protocol as the sort of paradigmatic, everything is dictated by the international agreement, it's legally binding, and most of the rules are written down, you can't sort of get out of them. And the opposite being like the Copenhagen Accord, which essentially says, everybody pick your own target and decide your own rules, and was accused of being kind of a Wild West type approach. And then you've got the Paris Agreement being kind of a hybrid on both of these counts, where you move away from the bifurcated treatment of parties, and you also have this sort of sweet spot in terms of international requirements and national discretion. So those are some of the top contentious issues over the years that have had to been dealt with. So I'm going to go through just 10 conceptual categories of how we tried to resolve disputes over the years. There are more. I've written an article that has 30 in it if anyone's very nerdy and interested in more examples. But here are sort of top 10. The first one is postpone. So I don't know that you could necessarily do this at the domestic level, national level, state level, but at the international level, you know, whatever you don't absolutely have to decide, you can actually put off into the future. Sometimes we put off issues with a date certain to resolve them, and sometimes we just sort of put them off and, you know, with no requirement to come back to them. The second one, which I call revisiting, means like you win for now, but we're going to come back to that issue. So you're not postponing the issue, you're actually taking a position on the issue, but it's not forever. So like the very first treaty on climate change, the target was not legally binding because of the United States, but the EU said, all right, you win for now, but in a couple of years, we have to come back to that issue and look at it again. And that's exactly what happened. The third is called constructive ambiguity. Again, I don't know that this exists at the national level or the state or tribal level, but at the international level, this concept of constructive ambiguity is used where you deliberately write something so it can be read in two different ways. And both sides can go home and say, you know, I won, essentially. Now, you can't use that for something that's like at the very heart of an agreement. Otherwise, you don't really have a meeting of the minds. But you can use it for more ideological issues and maybe more peripheral issues. And it's certainly been used a lot in the climate context. The fourth one is then raising or lowering the profile of some kind of element of an agreement. And there are many ways to do that. And usually they're based on location. So we have lots of options when we're designing an international agreement in terms of moving things around. First of all, an agreement usually has a preamble, which is sort of not really legally binding. It's the introductory verbiage, right? A lot of times if countries don't want to highlight something, they might say, well, I agree to that as long as it's put in the preamble, or as long as it's put in some secondary decision of the parties and not the legal instrument itself. Contrary-wise, countries might decide that it needs to be highlighted and move it into the body of the agreement. So placement is used as a kind of a device to resolve differences. The fifth one is just giving more flexibility to countries, and this relates to the issue of where are you on the continuum between national discretion and sort of international dictation. You know, you can take something and that was proposed to be legally binding, you can make it non-legally binding. Sometimes we give countries more time to do something. So it's the same commitment, but they have more time to do it. Sometimes you add adjectives like take appropriate measures rather than do X or Y simply. Sometimes you add language to make clear that a commitment is self-judging, so nobody else can come along and say, you know, you need to do X or Y. So you might say something like, as each party determines necessary, meaning it's solely within its power to decide. The sixth one is what I call incrementalism, meaning just often you can't reach agreement to go from A to Z, but you can reach agreement to go from A to B or A to C, and the next time from C to D, and the next time from D to E. So some manifestations of that are, in the climate regime, for example, the very first treaty was called the Framework Convention, and it had very little kind of biting requirements in it, but it was a way of bringing the whole country in. Later, it was developed in terms of subsequent instruments that had much more stringent commitments in them. The next one is called borrowing, and that's basically when you reach an impasse in the negotiations, but you sort of in the back of your mind, you know, we've seen this issue before. Somebody grabs a document from last year. It might be from those very parties. It might be from some other UN forum. In the climate negotiations, what happened, especially during the Paris negotiations, was that the US and China had reached agreement bilaterally at the head of state level a couple times before Paris. So when the global negotiations got stuck on a few important points, they decided to just reach for the language that the US and China had negotiated, because the US and China are basically at outer ends of the spectrum. So what they agreed to pretty much, you know, reflected what the world could agree to. The eighth point is that you often have to avoid particular words that countries have developed certain allergies to. If you look at the very first treaty on climate change, you'll notice that the parties do not report, they communicate information. You might say, like, why? Well, certain countries didn't like the word reporting. They felt like it was putting them in a kind of subservient position vis-a-vis the international community, but communicating was okay. If you look at the Paris Agreement, you'll notice that the article that's all about market mechanisms doesn't use the word markets because certain parties were allergic to that word. So you often have to kind of work around these, landmines. Just two more. So the ninth one is would be familiar to lawyers among you, which is to say that something is without prejudice to something else. A lot of times the way we reached agreement was to kind of pick a winner when one of the or more of the countries involved in the negotiations had an objection because they thought that outcome might be thrown back in their face at some future date. We would say, like, all right, how about if we say that it's without prejudice to some future issue, and basically everybody would be agreeing that it's just being used to resolve today's issue, but nobody would be hurt by it in the future. And then my last example is something I call saying what, not why. A lot of the arguments in the negotiations, a lot of them having to do with resentment and blame and North-South conflict and all of that, had to do with the reason why countries were proposing certain provisions. For example, everybody agreed that certain developed countries would provide financial assistance to certain developing countries. Some suggested that it should say why that was the case, and their argument was that it should say this was compensation for emitting too many greenhouse gases. Well, you can imagine that the developed countries, even though they were agreeing to pay this kind of money, they were not agreeing to say, like, this was our fault and the reason we're doing it is because of compensation. Their argument would have been, we're doing it because we have the money and it's in our interest for you to take this kind of action. So in those kind of cases, usually the competing reasons would just kind of drop out and you'd be left with the who does what. And it's almost a form of constructive ambiguity because everybody could go home and give their own reason, like why those provisions were in there. So I'll stop there, but I hope that gave you a little flavor of some of the tricks of the trade. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we have a few minutes left. We'd like to take questions from the participants via the chat box. If you have a question for our panel generally or any particular panelist, please type your question in. We do have a question. I'll kick us off with a question from David, who observes of Erin, almost all of your very interesting points apply to multiple kinds of environmental issues that involve externalities of public goods. And you tended to refer to climate change as a specific example of how those ideas apply. But some thinkers and advocates, including Bill McKibben, mentioned by Lucy, argue that the global nature and stakes of climate are qualitatively different from these other issues. So this question was directed at you, Erin, but also I invite the other panelists to weigh in as well. To what extent would you say climate needs to be thought of in a new and different way, as a particularized problem?
So I'll go ahead and start on the panel answering it. And thank you, David, for the question, because it's a really important one. And my answer is, I agree with the points that Bill McKibben and others have made that we need to think about climate differently in that the harm is so enormous and that it is impossible to manage at a local level. And what people do locally has impacts for other people. So the stakes are so great that we need to think about climate differently. But I don't think it changes the points that I'm making in my presentation. In fact, I would say the opposite. For the reasons that Joaquin explained in his presentation, no matter how global the impact, the resolution requires some kind of action locally. Even if we get a national or an international agreement that's going to be managed through, in the United States, national federal legislation, it has to be implemented locally. So even if for no other reason than getting the job done, it has to be, it will require some management at the local level. It doesn't take away from the urgency of the problem and the fact that in other areas, there may be a better claim for this is local and we don't want to hear about your concerns beyond our jurisdiction. That may be what what we want to differentiate. It's impossible to remove people's individual actions on climate change from their impacts and responsibility to the rest of the world. But I think we still have to deal with the problem of managing it at multiple levels of scale.
Other thoughts from the other panelists? Yep. Sue.
In the international sphere, I do think it's quite different and needs its own treatment. I mean, there were people who, after the Montreal Protocol and the ozone layer, said this is the perfect precedent for climate change because they're both issues that are not involving really transboundary air pollution, like one from over the border from one country to another. They're both involving impacts to something up in the atmosphere or stratosphere that it doesn't matter where they come from, right? Where the origin of the pollution is. But it turns out that precedent didn't work at all because climate is, as I was saying, implicates entire economies, not, you know, little pieces of the economy as ozone does. It's much more expensive to address. You know, the substitutes for ozone depleting substances were already kind of out there or about to be out there. So when you scratch the surface of those two issues, even issues that look very similar were not similar. And I think that's pretty much been borne out in the real world, where the climate regime has developed all kinds of idiosyncratic features that try to address its differences. Thanks.
You know, one observation I have, and I'm curious about your thoughts on this. You know, Sue, you talk about sort of the need to think about too at an international level, sort of how we both address but also try to tamper down the problem, get at the reason that we have this problem and keep it from getting worse. And Lucy, you talk about the idea of resilience against this existing problem at the local level. I wonder what your thoughts are on how efforts are best focused in terms of responding to climate change at each of these levels, the state, the international, the local. Does it, you know, at the local level, are we best to be focusing on resilience rather than actually our contribution to the problem? At the state level, are we do we need a leg in both worlds, looking at how we're contributing and also just a resilience? So how are you thinking about the way that you tackle the issue of climate change at each level?
Yeah, and for me, it's evolving for sure. And I think the idea of resiliency at the local level is excellent and needs to happen. But I'm also thinking that just the importance of the climate change means that there should be a way to actually include that interest at the table. A mediation brings together all the interests that have got a stake in this particular problem and should be part of this particular solution. And why not have a chair at the I'm not quite sure how that would look. I don't know who would sit in that chair, but I think I'm going to try to begin to work on ways that the processes that I'm mediating can actually have that interest at the table as a stakeholder in a much more real way. To date, it's been very vague. It's like whatever's happening locally is such a drop in the bucket. We don't need to think about that. And it may be true we're a drop in the bucket, but I think just in terms of people's awareness and idea that we're all part of a global community, I think it's important to put that interest at the table and figure out how to deal with it, how to satisfy that in whatever small, creative way can be done locally.
This question is for any of the panelists. What links do you see between climate change and the current COVID pandemic? And from a dispute resolution framework, how can we impact that?
I'll start in saying, I think the links are so patent that I've written about them on this exact point, and it is because the pandemic looks a lot like the kinds of incremental personal choices and activities at a personal and local level, spreading beyond the boundaries of anyone's individual decision making to impact others. And I actually think what I have written about is how the lessons of environmental governance require exactly the same techniques of trying to negotiate with communities of interest. And I'm going to tie this into the question that Bob Bordone also raised in the chat, where he says, how do we deal with the climate crisis as a topic of negotiation when not everybody even agrees that there is a climate crisis? And it would seem like the pandemic is that kind of a problem too. Part of the problem of solving it is that there are enough people who don't agree that there's a problem that needs to be solved, that it's extremely difficult. And so to me, that is almost the harder problem, is getting people to the table who think that there's no need for a table. I would hope in the climate crisis that California's orange skies are beginning to make a dent in that problem. And I would hope in the pandemic context, the same thing. I don't have the answer to that except for this strategic offering, which is, it seems in contexts like these where the problem is getting people to believe that they need to move somewhere, the negotiation maybe needs to happen between, what is the right word for this? Influencers. So communities they listen to different people, like different people become the kind of leader of a community of interest, and people are more likely to listen to their leader in their community of interest than they are to someone outside their community. And so I often think that sometimes the really important way to make progress on that front is by getting a negotiation together among the viewpoint leaders to maybe bridge gaps there, and then implementing, I would say, pandemic governance, public health governance, the same way that I think we should also be implementing climate governance at multiple levels, with speaking to different interest groups in terms that will be meaningful to them.
Yeah, I think the COVID response certainly shows how quickly we can mobilize and how quickly we can see those sorts of adoptions and understanding of, okay, well, what is the challenge? What can I do on a personal level? Although, and to Erin's point, we've seen something, I don't even know how best to characterize it. We'll say a backlash, or at least a pool of individuals that are incredibly resistant to then that sort of discussion. I think we'll always somewhat have that. It may be a feature of our media and otherwise that it gets a lot of sort of play, and that tension, itself becomes sort of a driving sort of discussion. And we see that in climate denial as well. But I think, as Governor Newsom recently said, we don't have time for climate deniers at this point. I think we clearly see these ongoing impacts, these extended impacts from the drought, and compounding impacts in communities. And I think, again, it will be communities that need to step up, that need to be provided, and to Erin's point as well, there are leaders there. It doesn't always have to be the state, talking down to a community, or at the federal level. That leadership is disparate in our communities. It needs to be empowered because these are local decisions that will have to be made for regrettably communities that have suffered from the wildfires here, about rebuilding. And what does that rebuilding look like? And is it what it was before? And here there too is really the challenge around the fact that there is a lot of uncertainty, and that is very difficult. And I think we're all looking for certainty, wanting to hold on to what it is we have, and be told that we can address climate change without sacrificing what it is that we have here in the moment. And I think it's letting go of that and realizing that our communities have been transitioning, are products of transition these last 50, 100 years, and that will continue to transition for the next 50 and 100 years. And it's really about what will that look like, and empowering individuals to make good decisions at the local level around the many compounding, again, stresses we see around climate change.
Sue, we have a request for you to send a link to the article that you referred to, your article you referred to earlier. So we have at least one climate nerd, negotiation nerd in the audience. If you send that to me, I'll go ahead and send it with our follow-up email today. But there's also another question for you, Sue, that I actually would be interested in hearing from all of you, and that's what your take on whether you believe that environmental protectionism and environmental laws are generally more neglected than other fields of law, and if so, why? Could a multi-tier negotiation solve these issues better than these laws that may be neglecting environmental issues?
Is that for me?
That's for you. I wonder though, I am curious whether Joaquin has a different impression since he's so he spends his life in immersed in environmental law and regulation.
Right, because at the international level, I don't know that international environmental law is any more neglected than any other field of international law. If you want to be really cynical about it. You know, it's not like domestic law that has enforcement and, you know, the ability of the government to come after you, or civil lawsuits and penalties and all of that. So there's kind of a limit to the, you know, the ways in which countries feel like they need to follow international law. And it's one of the big distinctions between international law and domestic law. But let's hear what Joaquin has to say.
Yeah, I don't know if neglected would be the word, or you know, when it comes to how environmental regulation or law is implemented, it's certainly difficult. And I think, you know, for the reasons that we've kind of covered, particularly around air and water, where it's, you know, it's not like land where it's, you know, it's there, it's not moving. You can, you know, go back to it a week ago. Water, you know, it's you either have an illegal diversion one moment or not. It's hard to tell when. And then when on water quality impacts, it's so diffuse and dispersed. So many of the impacts that impact our rivers and streams are the quality of them. And so I'll just say it's just kind of a different nature. But maybe a previous point, the difficulty as well, though, is that, again, environmental law is relatively new. And we've built up so much of our systems, our economies, our society, without necessarily the benefit of having a more robust discussion around what are the impacts, who, you know, who is, you know, when we talk about water, we often talk about the maximizing of beneficial use. And so if you are harming someone else's use of that water later on, it requires us to continually sort of check those externalities, I guess. And it's just, I know it's very difficult. And again, we're trying to build back in these considerations when there's relatively new.
Thank you. We are at our time, so I'm going to quickly wrap up. I apologize to all of you who posed questions that I could not get to. There's some particularly interesting ones in here for Lucy. I'm sorry, Lucy, we didn't get to hear you weigh in on those. But I extend a massive emotion of gratitude to our panelists for their time today and their thoughts. I do want to very quickly share with you a couple of upcoming webinars that we have here. On September 22nd, we've got a Negotiation Essentials webinar, the 24th, one on virtual negotiations, the 29th on dealing with difficult tactics. But then next month on the 27th, on the kind of eve of the election, we have another free roundtable event on polarization, dialogue, and election 2020. We'll send out an email with a link to a feedback survey after our event today, and in that will also be a link to this new roundtable, the description, as well as the bios of our panel, or a link to the bios of our panelists. So with that, I don't want to keep everyone over our allotted time anymore. Please join me in thanking our panelists, and thank you to all of you, the participants, for joining us today. Take care and be well.